I told a woman she looked stunning in the dim light of my living room, and she smiled and said I wasn't looking at the lights. My name is Nate, I'm 36, and for the past 3 weeks, the only other person breathing in this house has been Eleanor. She moved into my spare room with 2 suitcases and a story about needing a place to stay. I wasn't prepared for what she'd do to the quiet I'd built around myself, or for what she'd see when she looked at me. But by the time she said those words, I'd already stopped pretending I didn't want her to stay. But I should start from the beginning, before Eleanor, before any of this. I live in a small house on the edge of a town called Ridgefield, about 40 minutes north of Portland. It's not much by most standards. 2 bedrooms, one I use and one I don't. A kitchen with a window that looks out at the backyard. And the old cedar fence I built 3 summers ago, a porch that sags in the middle, and a driveway that cracks more every winter. The paint is faded gray, and the gutters need cleaning, but the roof doesn't leak, and the furnace runs steady, and that's enough for me. Decks, railings, drywall patches, cabinet installs, the kind of work that keeps a man's hands busy and his mind from wandering too far. I run my own crew, just me and 2 other guys, and most days we're on a job site by 7 and done by 5. I like the order of it. A crooked frame can be squared, a loose board can be fastened. There's a fairness in building things that people don't always give each other. I've lived alone for 4 years now. Before that, there was a woman named Sarah. We were together for 2 years, and she left on a Tuesday in March without much of an explanation. Just that she needed something I couldn't give her. I didn't argue. I didn't ask her to stay. I just watched her pack a bag and walk out, and then I went back to work the next morning like nothing had changed, even though everything had. The house felt different after that. Not empty exactly, just louder in its silence. Every creak of the floor, every tick of the heater, every rain gust against the window, all of it carried more weight when there was no one else around to share it. I got used to it, though. People get used to most things if you give them enough time. I'd wake up at 5:45, make coffee in the same mug, drive the same route to the same job site, come home to the same quiet kitchen, heat up whatever I'd made too much of the night before, and sit at the table with the window open if it was warm or the radio on if it wasn't. Weekends, I'd work around the house, fixing the porch boards, or cleaning the gutters, or staining the fence. Sometimes I'd drive into town for lumber and stop at the diner on the way back, sit in the corner booth, and eat a club sandwich, and listen to other people's conversations without joining any of them. The spare room stayed empty the whole time. I kept it clean, changed the sheets once a year, whether they needed it or not, and closed the door. It was a room that existed in the house the way a spare tire exists in a truck. You know it's there, but you don't think about it until you need it. And I didn't need it. I didn't have family who visited, didn't have friends who stayed over, didn't have a reason to open that door. So the room sat and waited, and I lived my life around it, and the quiet settled into the walls like dust, and I called it peace, because calling it loneliness would have meant admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. Then one Thursday evening, in late October, my phone rang while I was sitting on the porch with a beer, watching the sky go dark. My cousin's wife, Dana. She and I aren't close, but we're friendly in that way, family. People get when they see each other twice a year at gatherings. She asked how I was, and I said, fine, and she asked about the house, and I said it was holding up. Then she got quiet for a second, and when she spoke again, her voice had that careful tone people use when they're about to ask for something. She told me her younger sister, Eleanor, needed a place to stay for a few weeks. Something about an apartment falling through, a lease that didn't get renewed, a situation that Dana didn't explain in detail. And I didn't press on. She said Eleanor was between places and needed somewhere quiet to land while she figured out her next step. Dana knew I had the room. She asked if I'd considered letting her stay for a while. I looked at the darkening sky, listened to the rain start tapping the porch roof, and said yes before I had time to think of a reason to say no. It was a spare room. It was there for exactly this kind of thing. And if I'm being honest, There was a part of me, a small part I didn't examine too closely, that was curious about what another person in the house might feel like after 4 years of listening to my own breathing. Dana called on Thursday, and Eleanor arrived on Saturday evening. I spent Friday getting the room ready. I pulled the spare sheets from the hall closet and put them on the bed, the clean ones that had been sitting folded for a year. I moved the box of leftover hardware from the corner, screws and brackets, and a rusty level I kept meaning to throw out, and put it in the garage. I found a lamp that worked and set it on the nightstand. I opened the window for an hour to let the stale air out, then closed it again when the cold crept in. I stood in the doorway when I was done and looked at the room, the bed made up, the first time in years, the lamp casting a thin yellow circle on the wall, and it looked like a room that was waiting for something. I didn't know what Eleanor looked like. I'd met her once, maybe twice, at family things, years ago, and I couldn't picture her face at all. Dana had said she was 24, which seemed young to me in a vague way, the same way 24 probably seemed old to her. I didn't think much about it. She was family by marriage. She needed a place, I had one. That was the whole arrangement in my mind. She pulled into my driveway just after 7 on Saturday, driving a small blue car with a dent in the passenger door. I was on the porch when she got out, and the first thing I noticed was that she moved like someone who knew exactly how much space she took up and wasn't interested in making herself smaller. 2 suitcases, a tote bag over her shoulder, and a canvas backpack she pulled from the back seat. She set the bags on the porch, looked up at me, and smiled. "You must be Nate," she said, and her voice was lower than I expected, calm and steady, like she'd already figured me out from the drive over. "I must be," I said. She laughed once, short and easy, and picked up her bags like they weighed nothing. I reached for one, and she handed it over without a word, and we walked inside. She stood in the entryway and looked around, not critically, just taking it in the way you read a room the first time you walk into it. The living room with the old couch and the bookshelf I'd built from scrap wood, the kitchen visible through the doorway, the light over the stove. Still on, the hallway leading back to the bedrooms. "It's quiet here," she said, and it wasn't a complaint. "Quietest place I know," I said. She nodded like that was exactly what she'd hoped to hear. And I showed her to the spare room. She set her bags on the bed and looked around, touched the lamp on the nightstand, and sat down on the edge of the mattress like she was testing whether it would hold her. It did. "This is perfect," she said, and I believed her because there was nothing in her voice that needed convincing. I showed her where the bathroom was, where I kept the towels, how the hot water took about 40 seconds to warm up. I told her the kitchen was hers to use whenever she wanted, and that I usually made coffee around 6 if she wanted some. She listened to all of it with her hands in the pockets of her jacket, watching me explain my own house, like I was giving her a tour of someone else's life. "Thank you for this," she said when I was done. And there was something in the way she said it, not grateful, exactly, more like she understood what it cost to let someone into a space you'd kept closed for a long time. I didn't know how she knew that about me. I hadn't said anything that would give it away. But she looked at me then, standing in the doorway of the spare room, with the lamp behind her throwing soft light across her face, and she held my eyes for a beat, longer than you'd expect from a polite thank you. Then she turned and started unpacking, and I went to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water and stood at the window listening to the rain, and the house already sounded different to me. Fuller, like a room where someone had just turned on music in the next one, over, and you could feel the vibration, even though you couldn't hear the song. That night, I lay in bed and listened. Not on purpose, just aware, the way you become aware of a new sound in a place that's been the same for years. I heard her footsteps in the hallway and the creak of the spare room floor and water running in the bathroom. Then silence came. And it was a different kind of silence than the one I was used to. Not the silence of an empty house. The silence of a house where someone else had just gone to sleep. The first week moved the way a river moves around a new rock. The water finds its path and the rock stays where it is, and after a while, Neither one seems to notice the other anymore. She made coffee in the morning. I heard the pot start gurgling from my bedroom, and by the time I came out, there'd be 2 mugs on the counter. Mine black, hers with cream and sugar. She never asked how I took it. She just watched me make it once and remembered. That small thing stuck with me longer than it should have. I left for work before she was usually awake, and when I came home in the evening, she'd be in the living room reading, or on the porch with her phone, or at the kitchen table with her laptop open. She worked as a freelance photographer. She told me, which meant her schedule belonged to her and her income didn't, and she worked when she could and rested when she couldn't. Some days she'd be gone for hours off on a shoot somewhere in the city, and other days she'd be there all afternoon, her bare feet on the couch cushion, a book in her hands, the window open, and the sound of rain filling the room. I noticed things. The way she left whatever book she was reading face down on the kitchen counter, like the counter was a shelf she'd claimed without asking. The way she hummed while she washed dishes. Not a song I recognized, just a tuneless sound that came out of her when her hands were busy. The particular weight of her footsteps in the hallway, lighter than mine, but not tentative. She walked through my house like she'd always been there. One evening, we were both in the kitchen at the same time, me coming in from the garage with sawdust still on my sleeves, her pulling something from the fridge. Neither of us said anything. I poured water, she leaned against the counter, and we stood there for maybe 3 minutes in complete silence, just 2 people in a kitchen, while the rain tapped the window. It didn't feel strange. It felt like the most natural thing in the world, and I realized then that most people feel silence because they're afraid of it, but Eleanor wasn't afraid of it at all. She moved through it the way I did, like quiet was something you could walk inside of and feel at home. I started looking forward to coming home, not in a dramatic way. Nothing I'd have named out loud. Just that the drive back from the job site felt shorter, and turning into the driveway and seeing her car or the kitchen light on gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. A small, steady thing, like a house that holds warmth after the sun goes down. But warmth has a way of turning into something else before you notice. And I didn't notice, not yet. That part was still coming. About 10 days in, I couldn't sleep. I'd been lying in bed staring at the ceiling for an hour, my mind running through tomorrow's material order. And I finally gave up and went to the kitchen for water. Eleanor was already there, sitting at the table with both hands around a mug, staring out the window at the dark backyard. The only light came from the small one above the stove, the one I always left on because I liked knowing the kitchen wasn't completely dark when I walked through it at night. In that dim glow, she looked different, softer around the edges, like the light had found a version of her that the daytime didn't show. I couldn't sleep either, I said from the doorway. She didn't startle. She just looked up at me. And there was something calm in the way she took me in, like she'd been waiting for me to show up and wasn't surprised that I had. "There's still hot water if you want tea," she said. I poured myself water and sat across from her. For a minute, neither of us said anything. Then she started talking. Quiet and unforced. The way people do at midnight when the usual walls come down a little. She told me about the apartment situation. It wasn't just a lease that fell through. There was a guy she'd been with for 2 years, and when he moved out, he took half the furniture and the lease renewal with him. She said it plainly, no drama in her voice, just the facts. They'd been living together, and he decided he wanted something else, and she didn't try to change his mind because she'd already figured out that the something else wasn't about the apartment. The thing about sharing space with someone, she said, is you don't realize how much of the room they take up until they're gone, and then you're standing in an empty apartment wondering why it feels so big. I knew exactly what she meant, though I didn't say so. I just listened. She asked about the scar on my left hand, a pale line across the knuckle from a table saw kickback 3 years ago. I told her the short version, how the blade caught the grain wrong and came back at me faster than I could move, and the way the hospital had stitched it up with 12 neat loops that looked like they belonged on something other than skin. She laughed when I said that. Not at me, but with me. A low, warm sound that filled the kitchen for a second and then faded, and when it did, the room felt different, smaller. Like the walls had drawn in a little, and the two of us were sitting closer than we actually were. She was leaning back in her chair, one knee pulled up, watching me talk about my work with an expression I couldn't read exactly. Not boredom, not pity. Something closer to interest, the kind that makes you feel like the thing you're saying matters more than you thought it did. I went back to bed after a while, but I didn't sleep for a long time. I lay there thinking about the way she'd listened, not interrupting, not offering advice, just giving me room to talk the way my house had given her room to stay. And somewhere in the dark, without naming it, I felt something shift. A door I'd closed a long time ago was open again, and I wasn't sure I wanted to shut it. What I didn't know then was that she'd been opening that door from her side for days already. I just couldn't see it yet. After that midnight in the kitchen, I started paying closer attention. Not on purpose, I just couldn't help it. The signals were there, small and steady, and they added up in a way I couldn't keep ignoring. She saved me the best seat at the table every time we ate dinner together, which was most nights by then. She'd set my plate at the end where I could see the window and take the side chair for herself. She never asked if that's where I wanted to sit. She just put me there, like she'd figured out that I liked having the yard in my peripheral vision and decided that's where I belonged. She asked about my day and actually listened. Not the polite kind of listening, where you wait for your turn to talk. She'd set her phone face down on the counter and look at me while I told her about a joist that needed sistering, or a client who couldn't decide on cabinet pulls, and she'd ask follow-up questions that proved she'd been paying attention. Nobody had asked me about my work like that, since Sarah, and even Sarah had stopped after the first year. One morning, I came out of my room and found her standing at the stove in my flannel shirt. The red and black one I left draped over the back of the couch, because I wore it on cool evenings and couldn't be bothered to hang it up. She had it on over a t-shirt, with the sleeves rolled to her elbows. And when she saw me looking, she just said, "I was cold, and it smelled like wood." Then she handed me my coffee and went back to whatever she was cooking. I stood there holding the mug and staring at nothing for about 10 seconds because the image of her in that shirt did something to me that I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't just that she looked good in it, though she did. It was that she'd reached for something of mine because she wanted to be wrapped in it, and the thought of her wanting that made my chest go tight in a way I hadn't felt in years. She touched my arm sometimes. Not long, not dramatic, just her hand landing on my forearm. When something I said made her laugh, or her fingers brushing my shoulder when she squeezed past me in the kitchen. Each one of those touches stayed with me, for hours after, like a spot of warmth I could still feel on my skin long after her hand was gone. I caught myself watching her read on the porch one afternoon, the light catching her hair and the book open in her lap, and I stood at the window longer than I should have, just looking. She must have felt me there because she glanced up and caught me, and instead of looking away, I held her gaze for a second, and she didn't look away either. Then she went back to her book, and I went back to whatever I was pretending to do. I told myself these things were just friendliness. She was comfortable, that's all. When you share a house with someone, you learn their rhythms, you borrow their clothes, you touch their arm when you laugh. It doesn't have to mean more than that. That's what I said to myself every time I noticed something I couldn't explain. But then there was the hallway, and the hallway changed everything, even though neither of us said a word about it. It's a narrow hallway, barely room for one person to pass, and we met there one morning coming from opposite directions. She came from the bathroom, I headed for the kitchen, and we both stopped at the same time, facing each other, with about 2 feet of space between us. Neither of us moved, not right away. We just stood there, close enough that I could smell the soap on her skin, and she looked up at me with those steady eyes, and the moment stretched out like a held breath. Then she smiled, just a little, and stepped to the side, and I walked past her, and my shoulder brushed hers, and I didn't say a word about it for the rest of the day. A few days later, Eleanor had a friend over. A woman named Meg, around her age, who showed up with a bottle of wine and stayed for dinner. I gave them space, ate early, and retreated to the porch with my beer while they talked and laughed in the kitchen. I could hear them through the window, the particular rhythm of two women who know each other well, and I didn't mind. It was nice having voices in the house that weren't just mine and hers. When Meg left, I came back inside. Eleanor stood at the sink, rinsing the wine glasses, and she looked up when I walked in with something different in her expression, a kind of amusement held just below the surface. "Meg thinks we're together," she said, not looking away from the glass in her hand. I stopped in the doorway. "What?" "She said the way you look at me isn't the way a landlord looks at a tenant." She set the glass in the rack and turned to face me, drying her hands on the towel. Her words. I didn't know what to say. My face went warm, which I hated, because I'm not a man who blushes easily, and she was watching it happen in real time. I opened my mouth to explain, to say something about how Meg was reading into things, that I just looked at everyone the same way, that there was nothing behind it. But Eleanor didn't look uncomfortable, didn't look like she was about to tell me I'd crossed a line. She looked amused, the way someone looks when they've caught you doing something you didn't know you were doing, and they're deciding whether to tell you. She didn't push it. She just let it sit there between us, the way she lets silences sit, comfortable and unhurried. And then she said goodnight and walked down the hallway to her room, and I stood in the kitchen, listening to her door click shut. That night, I lay in the dark and replayed it. Not just the conversation, but everything before it. The way she looked at me in the hallway, the flannel shirt, the touches on my arm, the way she held my gaze on the porch. Every signal I'd been talking myself out of lined up in a row, and I couldn't unsee them anymore. I'd been so busy convincing myself that she couldn't possibly see me that way, that I was too quiet, too ordinary, too old for someone like her to look at twice, that I'd missed what was right in front of me. She'd been looking the whole time, and the only reason I hadn't noticed was because I didn't believe I was worth looking at. The doubt wasn't protecting me. It was hiding the truth. And the truth had been sitting in my kitchen wearing my shirt, looking at me like I was someone worth looking at for the better part of 3 weeks. A few nights later, it was raining again. The kind of steady October rain that doesn't let up, just keeps coming in a low gray sheet that makes the whole world feel like it's holding its breath. I came home from a job that ran late. A deck repair that took 2 hours longer than I'd estimated, because the framing was worse than the homeowner had let on. My back ached, and my hands were stiff, and I just wanted to sit somewhere that wasn't a truck seat. Eleanor sat on the couch reading. The small lamp on the end table threw its circle of light, and the glow from the kitchen behind me reached faintly across the floor. That was it. No overhead lights, no television, just the two dim sources that barely reached each other, leaving most of the room in a warm half-dark. She looked up when I came in. "Long day?" "Longer than I wanted," I said, and dropped into the chair across from her. It's a worn armchair I've had since before Sarah, the one I always sit in, because the cushion has shaped itself to the way I lean. I stretched my legs out and let my head rest against the back and stared at the ceiling for a while, listening to the rain. We didn't talk. She went back to her book, and I sat there, letting the quiet settle into my bones, and it was the same kind of comfortable silence we'd found in the kitchen, that first midnight, the kind that doesn't need filling. Then she closed the book and set it on the cushion beside her, and she looked at me, not a glance, but a look. The kind that sits on you and stays. And I knew in the way you know a storm is coming before the first drop falls, that the conversation was about to go somewhere neither of us could come back from. "You ever think about dating again?" she asked. The question came out easy, like she was asking about the weather, but it landed somewhere deeper, and we both knew it. "I stopped thinking about it a while back," I said. "Why?" I shrugged. The real answer was too honest for casual conversation, but it was late, and the rain was on the roof, and the light was low, and the usual walls were down. "I'm the kind of man people look past," I said. "I've made my peace with that." She went quiet. I could feel her eyes on me, studying me the way she studies things she's about to photograph, finding the angle that tells the real story. The rain kept tapping the glass, and the lamp hummed its faint electrical hum, and neither of us moved. I looked at her then, really looked, and in the dim light, with her hair loose around her shoulders and her knees pulled up on the couch cushion, she looked like something I had no business looking at the way I was looking at her. And the words came out before I could catch them, slipping past the filter I'd been using for 3 weeks, the one that turned every honest thought into something safe and distant. "You look stunning in this light," I said. The room held still. The rain held still, and my own heartbeat held still. Because I'd just said the one thing I'd promised myself I would never say, and I couldn't take it back, and I wasn't sure I wanted to. She didn't look away, or flinch, or blush, or drop her eyes the way I might have if someone had caught me off guard like that. She just looked at me, and the corner of her mouth lifted, slow and knowing, and she smiled. "You weren't looking at the lights?" she said. I stared at her because the words didn't make sense at first. I just told her she looked beautiful, and she'd thrown it back at me like a key I didn't know I'd been holding. "What?" I said. She stood up from the couch, unhurried and smooth, and she took a step toward me, then another, until she stood close enough that I could see the gold flecks in her eyes in a lamplight. "You weren't looking at the lights, Nate," she said again, softer this time, and there was nothing teasing in her voice anymore, just certainty. "You were looking at me." I didn't move, didn't breathe, just sat there in the armchair, with my hands on my knees, and my heart doing something it hadn't done in years, and I waited because she wasn't done. "I've been watching you," she said, "for weeks. The way you put my coffee mug out every morning before I'm awake. The way you look at me when you think I'm reading and you're pretending you're not. The way you held the door for me in the rain last week and stood there getting soaked while I ran to the car." Her voice was steady, matter of fact, like she was telling me something I should have already known. And maybe I should have. Maybe the signs were there all along, and I'd just been too busy hiding from them to read them right. She took another step. Close enough now that I could have reached out and touched her if I'd had the nerve. And I didn't. Not yet. Because I was still catching up to the fact that everything I'd been afraid to hope for was standing in front of me, saying it first. "I didn't move into this house because I needed a place to stay," she said, and her voice dropped a little, not to a whisper, but to the kind of quiet that only works when someone is standing very close. "I moved in because after one family dinner at Dana's, I couldn't stop thinking about the quiet man who fixed the porch railing without anyone asking him to. I sat there while the rain kept falling outside, and the lamp kept casting its thin glow, and this woman, who I'd been watching for 3 weeks while telling myself I wasn't, who I'd been thinking about every time I pulled into the driveway, who I'd been falling asleep, and the relief of it was so sharp it almost hurt. But the night wasn't over, not even close. Neither of us moved for a long moment. The room held its breath around us, the rain steady on the roof, the lamp throwing its soft yellow across her face, and the only sound was my own heartbeat in my ears, louder than it had any right to be. Then I stood up, not fast, just the way I do everything. Steady and deliberate, and I took one step toward her. Not closing the gap all the way, just narrowing it enough that the space between us became something we were both standing inside of, instead of on opposite sides of. She didn't step back. She tilted her chin up and held my gaze, and her eyes were steady and warm, and there was no hesitation in them at all. She'd made up her mind about this a long time ago. I was the one catching up. I reached for her hand. My fingers found hers, and she closed them around mine, not tight. Just enough to let me know. She'd been waiting for me to figure it out, and the touch was so simple and so long in coming that it carried the weight of every week we'd spent circling each other in this house without naming the thing that was pulling us together. Her hand was warm and her grip was sure, and I thought about all the nights I'd lain in bed listening to her footsteps in the hallway, and all the mornings I'd come out to find my coffee already made, and all the times I'd caught her looking at me and looked away because I didn't trust what I thought I saw. And here she was, holding my hand in the dim light of my living room, and she wasn't looking away. "I should have said something sooner," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I intended, because my throat was tight and I wasn't used to talking while this much was happening in my chest. "You said it at exactly the right time," she said. And then she stepped closer, and I put my other hand on the side of her face, and she leaned into it, and the rain kept falling outside, and the lamp kept glowing, and for the first time in 4 years, the house didn't feel too quiet. It felt full, the kind of full that comes from two people sharing a silence that already says enough. Later, after, I lay awake in the dark and thought about what had just happened, not with disbelief, not replaying it like a scene I couldn't believe was real. I thought about it the way I think about a house after I finished fixing it, walking through the rooms in my mind and checking that everything holds. And what I found was that I'd almost missed it, not because she'd hidden anything, but because I'd hidden myself. I built a quiet life to protect against being looked over again, and somewhere along the way I'd made myself so invisible that even someone who was trying to see me couldn't get through. I'd turned my solitude into a wall and called it a door. Sarah had left because I wasn't enough of something she needed. I'd carried that like a verdict for 4 years, a ruling on what kind of man I was, and it became the lens I saw myself through. The verdict that I was not enough, too quiet, too plain, the kind of man people look past. I'd said it out loud to Eleanor just hours ago, sitting in that armchair, and I'd meant it because I'd been believing it for so long it felt like fact, but it wasn't fact. It was a story I told myself, because the truth was harder to sit with. The truth was that Sarah and I were a bad fit, and a bad fit doesn't mean something's wrong with either piece. It just means they don't go together. Eleanor and I were a good fit, not because she's younger, or because she showed up at the right time, or because the house was empty and she filled it, because she looked at me and didn't look past me. She saw the quiet and the steady and the hands that fix things, and she decided those were the things worth staying for. That's the part that cracks me open, that she didn't choose me despite who I am, but because of who I am. The early mornings and the sawdust and the silence that I thought made me forgettable. Those were the things that made her stay. She walked into my house and recognized something in it, and in me that I'd been treating like a flaw for half my life. A crooked frame can be squared, a loose board can be fastened, but a man who can't see his own worth can't be fixed by anyone else. He has to let someone show him first, and then he has to believe them. The morning would tell me whether I could. I woke up to the sound of her in the kitchen. It was the same sound I'd been hearing for 3 weeks. The gurgle of the coffee pot, the soft thud of a mug on the counter, the creak of the floorboard near the stove that always shifts when someone stands on it. But this morning it meant something different, and I lay there for a moment just listening to it, letting the difference settle into me. When I walked out, she stood at the stove in my flannel shirt again, the red and black one, and she turned when she heard me and smiled, and it was the same slow, knowing smile from the night before. The one that said she wasn't going to pretend any of it didn't happen. She handed me a mug. I took it. We stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard, the grass still dark and wet from the rain, the cedar fence I built holding steady. And the morning was just a regular morning in October, gray and cool and unhurried. "I've been thinking," she said, and her voice was easy, the same calm tone she uses for everything. "I might stay longer than a few weeks." I looked at her. She was watching me over the rim of her mug, and there was no question in her expression, no uncertainty about whether the answer would be yes. Just a calm certainty that matched the one she'd shown in the living room last night, the one that said she'd made her mind up about this a while ago and was simply waiting for me to arrive at the same place. "The spare room is yours as long as you want it," I said, and then I paused, because that wasn't right anymore. Not the spare room. She laughed, low and warm, and set her mug on the counter, and stepped close to me. And the morning light came through the window and touched the side of her face. And she looked up at me the way she did in the dim light last night, like she'd been looking at me for weeks and wasn't planning to stop. And I believed her. Not because she said the right words, but because she'd been showing me the right things all along, and I'd finally stopped looking past them. "I was hoping you'd say that," she said. And the house was the same house, and the morning was a regular morning, and the coffee was the same coffee I'd been making alone for 4 years, but the quiet between us wasn't empty anymore. It was full. The kind of full that comes from two people standing in the same space and neither one wishing they were somewhere else. The porch railing I fixed that night before she arrived is still holding strong. Sometimes the things you build without being asked are the ones that last longest.